is there anything in what you guys have been talking about theologically that we can draw on that you think would help to save the Unitarian movement?
Well, it's a big question. And I'll invite you, in the order that you spoke, to answer that, please. If you would start, Alan.
To save the unit. It's one of the things I write about quite a bit. And it's very concerning, isn't it, how small our movement is becoming. And I have that fear that we'll move beyond, or we are moving beyond that point that we can attain kind of critical mass in our movement, in our congregations. I was speaking earlier about kind of igniting, and it becomes quite difficult to ignite a sense of worship when numbers get really low. I take heart from the Christian tradition in that it only started with 11 people, so there is that thought that we could come back. We don't talk of resurrection that much in Unitarianism, which I think is a shame, because if we are dying, then that's what we're going to be looking for, isn't it? Some sort of resurgence and resurrection. We talk about, a lot of people are Unitarians, but they don't know it, which I think is a bit of an arrogant thing to say. And I think we need to move beyond that. And having sacred conversations, hearing people's stories. And I was hearing a conversation earlier on, whether it was a comment or in a conversation, when someone was saying that, it was Maud actually, wasn't it? It was saying that someone says, well, I'm this, and we say, oh, well, actually, you're this. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. Theologically speaking, how do we save the movement? I'm open to the idea of a miracle. I'm still, I still have enough faith to think that miracles can happen, but it's going to be a lot of work, and I think we are kidding ourselves if we imagine it's not going to be anything more than a lot more closures and a lot more decline over the next few years. But I'm still hopeful for a miracle.
Thank you, Anne. Jane.
See if I can organise the mess of thoughts I have about this. I don't think we'll save our movement by making our purpose saving our movement. We've got some higher calling than that, and if we're doing something good, it will be irresistible. That's my view on a good day. In terms of how it relates to what I spoke about, I think I feel heartened by the fact that there is so much overlap between the churched and the unchurched actually in values when you come to dig down a bit. I would like to see us, not that everyone who's taken the time and trouble to come here today. This is the definition of preaching to the converted, really, but to really own the fact that we've got something valuable, take trouble in ourselves and in our congregations to increase our theological literacy and our ability to speak about what that is, and make a space where people can encounter and engage with that. I mean, Suzanne, you know at Kensington we've tried to make as many different settings where people can work through their questions, the big questions of life, and much more kind of, much more, and engaging. Well, I'm saying engaging all the time because of course we do engagement groups so often, and that's one of the big forums I think for doing this, a place where people can bring their own stuff and not expect to be told the answers and not expect to have an end point to reach, but just to keep on engaging. Yeah, I could go on forever, so I'll stop there.
Not much more to add to that, really. Just we're not merely trying to perpetuate a system. We're not merely trying to create more clones of ourselves. And we're trying to invite people to recognize that there is actually a kind of process of exploration that's unique to now that can happen.
Thank you. I have John Clifford.
I'm not quite sure where to start, but my sense that if we're trying to articulate a reformed theology that speaks to the Unitarian history and experience, that we're being overly selective in our heroes. We've mentioned Martineau, didn't mention Emerson, didn't mention Carpenter, didn't mention lots of people whose sense of Unitarianism was much broader. And if I understand the gnosis argument, the death of God means that the divine was poured into all of reality, but the focus isn't on all of reality, it's on people. But we are part of a much larger reality, and part of our, salvation will have to be to serve that larger reality effectively and make this world a viable place. And people talk about building the kingdom of God, and that is sometimes meant, taken to mean building justice into the world. But there's also not just building justice into the world, there's making sure the world is protected and nurtured and all the creatures in it, and not just the people who have souls to save. So I'm concerned about a direction of Reformed theology that doesn't start with the larger reality of which we are a part, and really focus on what theology articulating, what our task is. And I agree very much with what Jane said about, we're not going to save ourselves by trying to save ourselves. If we try to save the world, and we are reasonably effective in our small ways, I think people will say they've got something that needs support and will help it.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. In fact, most of you can't see this, so I'll share it with you. But from where I'm sitting, I'm looking at a marvelous quote halfway up the pulpit, which is incredibly pertinent to what you've just said from the Gospel of Thomas, saying 77 by Jesus. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. So, the Christ in all of reality. But I mean, it's a very interesting question, John, and I'll hand over to the panel in whatever order you would like to respond.
The redivinizing of humanity, the redivinizing of creation as a whole. I'm a big fan of the Transcendentalist movement, Emerson and Thoreau, recognizing the need to reconnect with the beauty of nature and find God within nature, and that will surely be a part going forward of our Unitarian identity, definitely.
And although I think Lewis and I are coming from different angles, this idea of this divinity and humanity, to me, is going to be central in the Unitarian movement going forward, because the temptation, we all do it, when someone walks through the door for the first time, we see the new treasurer, or we see the new secretary, or whatever it might be, when actually maybe our starting point is we are seeing the image of God, we are seeing Christ, we are seeing something precious coming into our midst. and the gifts that they could bring us and we could bring them. And I'm totally with Jay. We don't deserve to survive if all we want to do is re-perpetuate just ourselves. There has to be a point to it. There has to be a purpose. We have to have something we believe that can bless the world. Otherwise, as someone said, why not just give the money to Oxfam?
I mean, I'm conscious that I am not as literate in Unitarian history as perhaps I might be, and I've been a bit more of a magpie theologically, really. But speaking personally, rather than prescribing this as a solution for us all, that's why I'm drawn to that sort of panentheism, that sort of seeing God working God's self out in absolutely everything. I think that whatever direction you think it's coming from, that reinforces my desire to care for it all. I should do my Unitarian homework.
Thank you. Lady there? Yep.
Thanks. The discussion that we were having in this bit that Susanna was referring to, we also talked about humanism and its possible influence in Unitarianism currently and going forward. And the question was raised on what would distinguish, if humanism is or becomes prevalent within Unitarianism, what would distinguish us from ethical societies? And the answer I gave to this question was, to me, Unitarianism is a space where humanists and theists and atheists and various sorts can be together and do work together, maybe in a more accepting and collaborative way than seems to be the position of, for example, Humanist UK, the former British Humanist Association. But saying that, so I'm a humanist and I'm interested in your positions on this whole question of humanism, which I think also goes back to the point about the source of ethics once you get rid of the transcendent. So yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Well, I guess we do weird things for a start. We get together and light candles and sing hymns, and we have a shared heritage which makes us distinct, and shared ways of speaking about things of ultimate significance. Yeah, so I would say that and I think also just the language of talking about things of ultimate significance, you go into a different kind of sphere of speaking than you do if you're just concerned with humanism in the narrowest sense of that.
My experience, which may be different to yours, is that within many of our congregations, we haven't got this diversity that we've been heard about just then, in that there's lots of humanists and theists and everything in between. My experience is that a congregation generally takes on some sort of identity, and they may call a minister whose theology is in line with that identity, or a minister may lead them down a certain line, but I don't see that diversity within single congregations that I often hear about that is said in our movement, which is why it's very important, I guess, that congregations come together at different points. But I'm certainly not seeing that in congregations that I've got any involvement in, that there is this huge diversity. It tends to me that they either Christian or humanist or earth-centered, and the majority in that congregation seem to take on that viewpoint. But in terms of humanism, I don't know if problem is the right word, but I'm always wary if we let go of words, if we let go of the word God, if we let go of the word prayer, then we allow it to be defined by somebody else, and the somebody else defining it might well be the fundamentalist end of things. So whilst we still retain an interest in those words and terms, we still have a stake in defining them to a degree.
I think I'm lucky enough to be in one of those congregations where that spectrum does exist. And it is really hard work to minister to a group that's that diverse and not do the lowest common denominator thing, doing something that's genuinely meaningful and genuinely religious, and that's what I aspire to. That's what I'd like to see us doing. I suppose the thing about ethical society is if anyone joins a congregation at any point, they're joining a congregation and a denomination with a history. And I think to show due respect to that history and continuity with that, I would hope we wouldn't rush to that ethical society because the ritual and the language and the whole, to go back to what I was saying, the language game and all the rest of it. If that's how you view it, and it might be how you have to view it if you're a dyed-in-the-wool humanist in a congregation that's using that sort of religious language. That's something we're offering that nobody else is, and I think there's power. It supports us in our doing our good works or whatever. It gives us a certain obligation to each other that might not be present in an ethical society without the rest of it.
Yeah, well, I've got, sorry, the lady there.
Thank you. Like Jane, I'm lucky enough to belong to a congregation which is fairly diverse, and I think many Unitarians, people come along to a Unitarian church so that their beliefs can be respected, so that they have the freedom to believe as they wish to believe. But what I've been hearing today is something I've never heard before, which is the phrase that you used about the death of Jesus but the birth of Christ, and then the idea of the death of God. And many of the people who do come to us come from having had a previous Christian background. And I think if they heard those ideas, it might very well put them off. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Again, any response? There's not a we could take a few more questions, but would anyone like to respond to that?
Only in as far as I think what we keep wrestling with is there a distinct Unitarian path? And I know I've had people be disappointed because they've come to us expecting there to be a distinct Unitarian path, and the answer we give them is, oh, hey, you can tread your own spiritual path, which might not actually satisfy what they're looking for. I don't think that answers your question about whether it would put people off or not, but we're still struggling, aren't we, centuries later, to define what Unitarianism is, and it's certainly changing fast, isn't it?
My experience has been that most people that find themselves in a Unitarian church are people that are trying to deal with a lot of Christian baggage, and they've felt burnt or bruised by the Christian tradition that they used to be part of, and it's not an adequate response to just say, that was painful, we now need to leave that behind us and now move forward into something entirely new. You need to confront the pain of what you experienced and try and get behind some of that and uncover some of the depth in that tradition, I would suggest.
Well, just add a comment really that, I don't know if this is useful and I don't know if anybody will agree with me, but I've heard Lewis preach, and he doesn't preach on about the death of God. I think we're talking theology here, which isn't always what you do in a Sunday service, I think. So, it is at that level, or, it's at many levels, including stuff that you wouldn't necessarily just be coming out with each Sunday. But I think, was there somebody over this side before I get Gosh, Bob, sorry, yeah, Bob's, Maud, Stephen, yeah. Perhaps we'll take a few, if that might be easier, unless you want to respond. Should we take Bob, Maud, Stephen? And then, sorry, it's, of course, Ray.
Well, this is most obviously in response to Jane's talk, but I'd be interested in what any of you would have to say about this. But it made me think of the phrase, I believe in love, which is I often hear in secular culture and in religious culture as well. And, you know, I thank you for the talk, because I often thought of that as a bit trite, really. But thinking about how it's, in ordinary language, how it's actualized in people's lives, it can actually be very, very profound, how people often says it. And the call, the challenge to how people live can be really profound. And it made me wonder, and I wonder if any of you, especially yourself, Jane, could speak to how contextualizing that statement within Christianity in general and progressive Christianity in particular might be helpful in seeing how that statement can really have a powerful call to a life to say. And what does it really mean when someone says, I believe in love? Obviously, it can mean a lot of different things, but if it means something challenging and something transformative, you know, what does that mean, and what does our context say that it might mean?
Maybe, Jane, you could just respond to that. Yeah, that would be great.
Oof. I mean, I think that's the work of a lifetime, is my preamble to whatever I say. I think that's why I introduced that notion of right loving, right eros, right agape, that we attune ourselves to a call of love, which might be expressed as a drawing towards beauty, a drawing towards suffering. I'm thinking of that "still I am one" phrase, like that sort of faced with the overwhelming need of the world and the extent of creation, almost that to live out a life of love, we just got to go where we're called. And so perhaps historically we've made too much of a distinction between sacred and profane there, and not credited a wider spectrum of loving as being God involving. I am struggling a bit because it's the most immense of questions.
Well, maybe there's a lot of hands going up now, so perhaps let's move to a few more questions. Maybe I've got you down, Ralph, but I've got Maud next.
Sorry, maybe I should skip, because I kind of really want to just reiterate something that's been said. I'm the third person who's contradicting you, Ant, that having spent 8 years as minister with Unitarians in Edinburgh, I think there are two members from Edinburgh here. You would possibly agree with me that Edinburgh is one of those congregations that really is deeply diverse within one congregation. And yeah, I agree with Jane, it's hard to minister to that, and yet it's where I wanted to be and where I wanted to, we ministered to each other. And in fact, I think the great growth and engagement in that congregation was because they were sitting beside each other, arch sort of materialist atheists and theists and deeply committed astrologers and theosophists, and really mostly deeply respecting each other and realizing that there were some areas that they couldn't be in conversation with, but respecting each other. But it does leave that problem for our ongoing journey as a wider community. How do we define ourselves? And this is an old chestnut that keeps coming again and again and again. How can we define ourselves to the wider world when it's so difficult to define ourselves to ourselves? And yet, I mean, I often define myself as an agnostic minister. I'm not sure exactly what I believe. And so, sometimes that's really difficult. And I'm challenged as how can you be a minister when you really still struggle with your own faith and what you believe. And yet, so much of the world is struggling with the questions of what they believe. And so I feel, in some ways, as I wrestle with questions of belief and faith, I'm sort of in there wrestling with a huge number of people of any interest in faith and belief. Let's do that wrestling together. I don't know if that helps us in defining how we can sort of express ourselves and open ourselves out to the world. But for me, it's just about being honest where I am. Still very much wrestling with questions about belief and God and where I am on this. I certainly haven't come to any conclusions, but I hope sort of in community we can continue that wrestling.
If we could go to Stephen now, just to take a few questions at a time, I think might be easier.
This question is sort of inspired by Jane's work, but it's two simple questions in a way to all of you, to all three of you, bearing in mind the theologies each of you have explored today. Does God love you? And do you love God?
Maybe we've got in those two questions enough. What common ground have we got from Maud? And then, does God love you from Stephen?
I mean, I nearly shouted out yes before you got to the end of the question. But to justify that is almost impossible. I'm going to start speaking without knowing quite where it's going. Because I'd already started going down this line through something that Maud had said, and I think it will connect eventually. And also, they all come together. That sort of the love being the thing that keeps us in the room in those settings. So where you said they've got that massive diversity of people who otherwise would be at loggerheads. And I was thinking, the understanding I have of God is the thing that keeps me going, that keeps me from collapsing in a heap in the face of all of it. And it is the sense of, because of that panentheistic view for me, that we are all of one body, although I wouldn't have used Christ language especially, but there's something about that intuitive, I'm loved because we're not separate. And I love because we're not separate. I mean, this is why I'm apathetic.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
When anyone asks questions like that, I go straight back to Bible verses I learnt in Sunday school, and I would straight away say, well, nothing can separate us from the love of God. But then I think, and I live a very charmed and privileged life. So it's very easy for me to say, I love God and God loves me, because generally life's very good for me. Whether I would answer the same question if I was going through something absolutely horrific, I don't know. So perhaps my job or our job is to make that love more widely known by drawing alongside those who are going through terrible things. I was struck by the earlier question about the things we hold in common. It seems to me we have an impossible task when we try and advertise ourselves, when we try and advertise ourselves nationally as a movement. The definition has to be so wide, and then when somebody looks at that and goes along to one of our congregations and it doesn't quite fit in with that definition, I would always say that I think it might be better if local congregations were much better at advertising themselves rather than it being a movement-wide thing. But to go back to that question, yes, I believe God loves me, I love God, but with a caveat, but I've had a very blessed life.
In as far as God is the gathered, divinized community of people, preferably with a beer in hand, I would say yes and yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for those. Now I have Ray and then Ralph. Let's take two if we can, at least. And is there anybody else still? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's more a comment than a question to the panel. I'm a Unitarian only a few years, so I don't have a long history in it. But my point would be more of one of hope, in the sense that I totally agree that the theology is the reason why this conference is on is very important, and to have a strong theology, or a theology that as a backbone that people can understand. And taking it from the conversation and something that I know about Unitarians, there isn't a definitive theology there. So it wouldn't be a bad idea for us to have some sort of thing. So I think these conferences will be a brilliant thing going into the future. And Jim mentioned the book earlier there, Turning Point. I don't know if some of you have read it as yet, but I've started reading it. It's about the universalists in America and how they are beginning to change their view of what the freedom and tolerance and so on into another set of principles to live your life by. And although the theology is very important and it gives us a basis, it's probably actually, if we're talking about saving ourselves and maybe helping other people as well, it's more the practice that's probably actually more important than the theology. Now, I know we're talking about theology here today, and that's it. But in the sense of what do we do going forward, I think there actually probably will be, and I hope there will be, and I think there will be a change over the next few years in the idea of what Unitarians think, based on certain things from that book, from theology conferences like this, and then this going out into the general population of the congregation. So I would still have a fairly optimistic view of the future of Unitarianism rather than a dire view.
Thank you, Ray. That's encouraging. Ralph?
I'm going to make my comment with an apology because I have an advance purchase train ticket and I'm going to run out the door in a minute. Several people talked about unchurched people and talked about the secular society, and I would add anti-church people, and how do we attract them. And it may be different for other congregations, but in Hull, which has a very small attendance on Sundays, we have 16 new attenders in the last year. None come on Sunday, because we've commenced a meditation group. And these people are unambiguously anti-church. They wouldn't dream of coming to a worship. But the comments they make about the meaning in their life of coming to meditation during the week in a Hull Unitarian Church is quite impressive. So I think we Unitarians are a bit locked into this. It's what matters is who comes on Sunday. I think we've got to think again about what divinity really means.
Thanks, Ralph. Is there anyone else? Philip? Oh, sorry.
Thank you for allowing me a second bash. Once again, as a layman, what I'm looking for from my theology is a system of principles and values, a method of managing myself and feeling good, and making myself feel good, and also some method of coming to terms with my fate. And then lastly, yes, God is within me, and I do modestly love myself.
Thank you, Philip. Well, we'll just hold a minute. Gentleman there.
I'm going to forget the questions in here.
I don't know what it's like in any of your chapels, but in the chapels that I visit, the age profile should I say, is on the more mature side. How do you think we can get our message over to the younger generation, who, after all, will be the Unitarian movement taking it forward?
Yeah, well, that's... Sorry, James Barry, did you want to talk, James? James is not only running our sound system within the chapel, doing the filming, he's also now appearing down here and asking questions. So thank you, James.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we're beating ourselves up a little bit. Yeah, if you want certainty in theology, then you don't go to a Unitarian church. You go somewhere where they've got a very definite single view. But we have got common ground amongst all the Unitarian and free Christian churches, which is it's doubt, it's freedom, it's spiritual journeys, and the people that go to the churches love it. We perform a very good service for those people, and there are common things. It's quite easy to say, go to a Unitarian church and be challenged. Go to a Unitarian church to hear things that are going to make you think again. I think the whole purpose why people are here today is because they're hearing a different aspect of theology, which is going to make them think on the way home. I've thought some of the things I've heard today, I was thinking, that's a load of rubbish. And then I was thinking, hang on a minute, no, think about that, etc. And that's the whole point. That's the journey. That's the spiritual change. So we do perform a purpose. We have got a future. It's trying to persuade people and make people understand that we are different to other churches, but that should be our advantage, and it's incredibly in tune with 21st century Britain and all these people doubting and all these people challenging traditional religion. So I think we're beating ourselves up a bit. I think we have a future.
Thanks, James. Just final comments. Who hasn't spoken? No, you've all spoken. Is the lady there? Then, yeah. Sorry, you. Yeah, I think.
Sorry, my name is Martha, since I seem to want to speak a lot. Sorry to speak a lot, but I think partly I'm trying to answer a question that was just posed, because I am a young Unitarian, and not only that, but I didn't grow up in the movement. I've only been a Unitarian a couple of years. And I'm a member of a congregation which is New Unity in London, which is growing fast, changing fast, lots of turnover, and I've been thinking a lot about why that is. So I'm just going to throw something out, and I am interested in what the panel thinks. Maybe, like Jane said, we shouldn't save our movement for the sake of saving our movement. And I think maybe what we're trying to do today is figure out why should we save our movement? What is of value in our movement? And as a millennial, and as an urban millennial as well, I'm going to venture an idea that we might need to change some of our language and some of the way that we present our movement. We are no a Christian movement, and it's very important, I think, to keep our history in mind, because it's so rich, but I think we need to present ourselves more clearly as a diverse movement that can offer something unique. And do we call ourselves a religion? And maybe we do, but how do we define religion? How do we define faith? I think it's very easy for us to, because we might have some shared language, some way of doing our discerning and of grappling together, to then forget that the people that are not yet through our doors don't know what we mean. So let's change our movement to save our movement.
Thanks, Marta. And perhaps you could pass it to Susanna and then Chris, and that'll be it from the floor, I think, because we're moving towards the end now, and then we'll take final comments from the panel.
Yeah, this is also responding to what people have been saying. So for those of you who don't know, I was involved with the student ministry project in Cambridge Unitarians, which is known as the Free Thinkers. It only lasted for 6 months, sadly. So I guess I can give a kind of response to what would draw in young people just from knowing what didn't draw in young people. So, for context, I came out of the evangelical tradition, like a lot of us, and by the way, the person who didn't like the death of God, I found the concept.
I can't hear you very easily. You're speaking a bit fast, I think.
Sorry, I speak fast. So for the person who didn't like the death of God, I've found death of God theology very helpful in terms of framing my own experience in terms of moving out of evangelicalism into Unitarianism. But one weakness that I noticed in Cambridge Unitarians when working there was a distinct lack of spirituality, which I think potentially could be part of a problem. I mean, the congregation as a whole is doing well. They're very Christian focused, which could be, could explain their high numbers. But in terms of youth engagement, I think young people do want spirituality. Otherwise, why would you go to church? Particularly if you're coming out of, a more conservative tradition, which a lot of us are, particularly LGBT people or people who for other reasons have felt very, very hurt by the church. You still want to maintain your faith, but just in a different context. And so you want, my suggestion is spirituality is the way forward, not Christianity, not humanism, not, different interpretations, because they're all useful. But I think, that's my guess.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And finally, Chris, and then we'll come back to the panel for final comments.
Just a very quick one. Came at the end of just something I'd scribbled down at the end of Jane's talk, but also brings in a little bit of what Ant said. I think people have a dissonance between their sort of their love and their experience of love and their God and their experience of God, and how people wrestle with this and how do we rectify it. And indeed, I'm beginning to come to a thought already that maybe that is our primary role, to deal with that wrestling between those two facts.
Thank you. Well, let's invite the panel to give final comments on anything from today, really, particularly perhaps the last few comments and questions. And then we'll, wrap this part of the day up. Thank you.
There's something I wanted to say about the recurring theme of kind of how do we attract the youth or the whatever group of people it is. I think sometimes in our congregations we don't think hard enough about what people's lives are like. In London, and probably similar issue to you, Martha, that there's the huge turnover. People who are living and working in London under 40, they're working multiple jobs, they're working irregular hours, they don't know in advance when they're going to be around. They've got every reason to want to stay in bed on a Sunday morning. And the way that we've tried to respond to that at Kensington is by offering other things during the week, offering other flavours. Not, this is my personal take on it, not diluting the language particularly, not diluting the ritual, but just mixing it up a bit, allowing more informal opportunities to connect to the same underlying religious message.
I would echo that in response to what Ralph said. Our major feature of growth in my own congregation has been people coming to something during the week first, and that's what we've been concentrating on the last few years, more ways for people to engage with us, often in a social event, just to get people comfortable coming through the door and getting to know us a bit. And then down the line we say we've got this special activity happening 2 Sundays time, so would you perhaps like to join us for that? We have got examples of congregations which are growing and which have grown, but I would always caution, let's not look to those congregations as the way to do it, because in those congregations which are growing and have grown, there's still a lot of things that haven't worked. I can say that in my own congregation. For everything that has worked, there's been 10 things which have not. I I think we should be looking outside of our movement for examples and expertise into how to grow our congregations. I don't think we have that expertise in any great detail in our movement. But to going back to what Jane was saying and what a few people have been saying about theology, about talking about it, about doubt and about faith, there is a point that talking about theology has to end. And for me, it is in that moment, as often happens in my ministry, when I'm going to see someone who's dying or a family who's just lost a loved one and they say to me, he is in heaven, isn't he? Or God does love me, doesn't he? And at that point, my doubts about theology go and I just say, yes. And love casts out fear, as the scripture says, and to me it always comes back to how can I show love in this situation? And sometimes it isn't about articulating doubts, it's about helping people to affirm faith.
I don't really have much more to add. It seems to me that most growth in congregations tends to happen that the minister will attract people within their age bracket. A lot of the time that seems to be the case. I definitely attract more millennials as a rule as new people than anybody else. And those millennials are almost always, actually always, people that are initially very put off by church because they perceive church as a place where you have to believe the unbelievable. And yeah, by having conversations, by having, as I was talking about, conversations in the pub over a beer, etc., you're able to break down a lot of those misconceptions and yeah, that's all I have to say. But I look forward, I've very much enjoyed today, and I look forward to the conversation carrying on this evening with all of you.
Yep. Yeah, well, I'll echo that. Thank you very much to all our panelists for providing such a stimulating and wide-ranging, interesting day.